Okay, welcome everyone. This is the second training in our summer series. My name is Arissa Soper and I'm a Realty Business Specialist in GSA's Great Lakes region. And today I'll be your host and moderator. Before we hear from our Public Building Service Regional Commissioner, John Cook, let's cover a few housekeeping instructions. First, please know that today's session is being recorded. We have automatically muted your audio to help us control the sound quality of the presentation. If you experience any issues with your audio and you have called in or had the system call your phone, try using the listen only option to broadcast the presentation through your computer speakers. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A box. You can find it at the bottom of your screen and just type your question or comment into the box. We hope to encourage an interactive dialogue using this feature. We will try to address all the questions during the session today, either in the chat or as part of the presentation. Any questions that we are unable to get to today will be noted and all questions will be answered and emailed to all attendees. You will also receive a copy of the presentation after today's training. And now it's my pleasure to introduce PBS's Regional Commissioner, John Cook. So as of now, all the panelists will turn off all of our cameras.
Thank you, Arissa. This year's take on a regional customer forum with our virtual summer series. This is forum number 2 of 3. We appreciate your taking the time to join us and are looking forward to fostering the partnership and conversations we started last August. We couldn't let the pandemic stand in the way of our great momentum. I know our teams usually meet in person throughout the year, but I love hearing from our staff about how we're staying the course and adapting to the circumstances. It sounds like everyone is leveraging technology to continue to meet virtually and move forward with the work, despite the physical distance between us. I guess we're all in new territory with the forum being done in a virtual format this year. That being said, we want to especially acknowledge and encourage you to participate as much as possible. The team has been working hard to put technology to work to make it more interactive and engaging. As you have likely seen from emails, we will also be hosting one more session later this summer. Today we'll be talking about the Pricing Policy 5th edition, sharing what's new and what's changed. In August, we're putting together a direct charge demo. We want to give you a look into pricing a project with our direct charge policy. I hope you'll join us again at a future session in August and spread the word to your colleagues. And so with that, and without further ado, I will turn it back over to Arissa. Thank you.
Thank you, John. As John said, today's session is called Pricing Updates, which highlights changes reflected in the Pricing Desk Guide 5th edition. Our presenters today are Kimberly Barnes-Staples and Cece McCobbin. They are the pricing points of contacts for the region, and they're available to provide any assistance you need regarding pricing questions, policies, etc. Assisting them is Gia Roberts, a Realty Business Specialist, also in Portfolio. Now I'll hand it over to Cece to kick off the presentation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. During our training session today, we will share with you the website where you can find the Pricing Desk Guide 5th edition. We'll then be presenting the various updates contained in this newest edition. The listing of what's new in the 5th edition is also included in Chapter 1 of the Desk Guide. So early this fiscal year, the long-awaited 5th edition was finally issued. It was effective November 16th of 2019. However, many of these changes represent policy catching up with current practice. As you'll see, many of the changes we'll be discussing were in practice prior to the issuance, sometimes for years prior to the issuance. So this slide shows you where you can find the pricing desk guide. This external website has access to the 5th edition, and when you click on the hyperlink, which you'll be receiving a copy of this presentation, the hyperlink will take you to that site. So before we begin, we have a poll question to test your, or to check and see what you feel like your pricing policy knowledge level is.
Okay, the first poll question is, what is your level of expertise or experience in pricing? Are you a total beginner? Are you do you have minimal expertise, average, or definitely above the average? We'll give you a few seconds to vote. Okay, it looks like the majority have minimal expertise. So hopefully we can bump that up a little bit after this training. Okay, back to you, Cece.
Okay. So here's the changes that we'll be covering, along with, in blue, what you see this section reference from the pricing desk guide with the change. We'll talk about lease term strategy, the OA signatures, both leased and federal, in chapters 2 and 3. The change in the SDM remeasurement for federal space. We have some changes in the building shell definition that applies to both leased and federal. We've moved to a 10-year shell rate for federal space in the last several years. And we have some adjustments, have some changes to the threshold for billing adjustments that I'll share with you. That applies to both leased and federal. Tenant floor cut is another change that is applicable to certain spaces in owned buildings. We have a few changes also in our release of space process. Restoration of building failure, change there that I think everyone will be happy with. How we manage joint use, and also we have some that covers our FIT program, which is our furniture and IT program in leased and federal space. So now I'll turn it over to Kim.
Thank you, Cece. The first change that we want to share with you is something that, like many of these changes, has been in effect for quite a while. This one since April of 2016. And the lease term strategy doesn't really affect you as a customer, although it's something you may want to be aware of. Basically, we have unhooked the lease term from the OA term. So if you are requesting an OA term of 10 years for your space, we may go out and do a lease for a longer term, for 20 years, because market conditions will allow us to get a better deal for us, as well as a better deal for you. Your OA billing would reflect that. On our side, this will help us reduce the number of lease projects that we have to do. It hopefully will help us get better rates, and it should not affect your billing or your occupancy at all. At this point, we have another question for you to test your pricing knowledge.
Okay, the next poll question. Is a customer signature required for an increase in the TI amount that will be amortized in the rent? Yes or no? Looks like the majority of people are saying yes. Are they right, Kim?
That would be the correct answer.
All right, perfect. Okay, back to you.
Okay, so that was a clue that our next topic is the OA signature guide. So our OA signature policy identifies when a customer signature is required. And as you can see, with minor exceptions, these requirements have been in place since 2015. We've added a clause to our OA which allows GSA to proceed with a succeeding lease or a renewal when a customer continues to occupy space at the same location but fails to return the signed OA. So this is in place to hopefully avoid our leases going into holdover, which we always try to avoid. And when it's in the government's interest, the LCO can award a lease without OA signature, but with regional approval. So that's not something we would do except on rare occasions. So just so you're aware, we always make a very concerted effort to work with our customers to obtain their signed OAs and answer any of their questions and keep them apprised of you know, the up-to-date rent costs that they can be expecting. So it's rather rare that we used an approved exception in order to proceed without a signed OA. So like with the preceding pricing desk guide, the current pricing desk guide has separate chapters that relate to leased space and owned space. So chapter 2 is pricing for leased space, and chapter 3 is pricing in federally owned space. So as you can see here, this is for leased, but for new requirements, whether that's an initial occupancy or backfill occupancy, and any time we are adding a TI allowance to be amortized into the rent, or a new TI amortization, we require, and even for a parking for the initial new requirement, we do require a signature on those. So all these slides are showing tables that are directly out of the pricing desk guide. This shows for leases in continuing requirements. We now provide a clause that indicates that if a lease is extended with no increase in the square footage or any increase in the annual rent, we're able to proceed without going out to get a new signed OA for that. Of course, we have, in many cases, our leases include a CPI adjustment. Those adjustments are done annually, and also that would not require a signed OA for that. So the CPI adjustment would go along usually with that extension. Now, if your extension results in an increase in square footage, or if the rent is going to go up, then we do send out an OA in advance of that lease action to get a signature in order to proceed. So as we mentioned earlier, succeeding leases and exercise of renewal, we can act without, but we generally are going to try to obtain that. So now we're moving on to owned. So this is a table out of the owned chapter 3. And as with leased locations, those initial occupancies and backfills and any initial commencement of amortization of TIs, we always need to get signatures for those. However, for continuing occupancies, a signature is not required. We'll update the rate, we'll extend the term, and we'll process those as a matter of routine. Next. So also similar to the leases, if there's an increase, we have to, so for expansions or changes in the OA term, or if we're adding, in that case, some additional TIs to be amortized, signatures are required. Joint use changes and parking changes, antenna changes, operating rate resets, no signatures are required for those. Although, as we said earlier, parking, if it's the initial parking, we do need to get a signature there. Okay, so BSAC, as we call it, which is Building Specific Amortized Capital. That's for capitalized security items. When those items come up, we are able to incorporate them into the affected buildings OAs, and we don't need signatures for that. For errors correction, we will attempt, so if we, for some reason, a rate or something has been incorrect in your billing OA, when we identify that and we create a corrected draft OA, we will send those out for signature so that you're aware of what's changing in your upcoming rent. Release of space, obviously before 2015, we used to be able to do release of space with a signed OA. That is no longer the case. And the new program, the FIT program, which is not, it's been around for a while now, but we require a signature to implement that. So Kim is going to talk about space assignment errors next, but first we have another poll question.
Okay, the next poll question is, GSA will not make changes to a customer's rent bill due to SDM maintenance if less than 50 rentable square feet. True or false? Okay, looks like true wins. We'll go to Kim to see if that is correct.
Thanks, Arissa. So our next topic is SDM Changes. This was effective way back in 2014. And for those of you who said that we will not change your OA for square footage corrections less than 50 square feet, you are correct. If in the course of maintaining our building drawings, we discover an error that affects your bill for less than 50 square feet, we will not make that change. SDM does maintenance periodically on all of our owned inventory. There may be instances where there was construction, some type of project. We may have done some work in the lobby or in the corridors that result in a change in usable square footage for some customers, a change in the RU factor, therefore the rentable square footage might change for customers. We do not make those changes on your bill. If we discover that in the course of the maintenance that there are substantial changes, we will notify you, and we do give you time to budget. But if it's less than 50 square feet, we will not make any change. And of course, this does not affect your ability to release square footage as part of a space release project. Space releases. This was effective back in February of 2016. One of the reasons that, so the policy has not changed. We require 4 months notice, written notice, for an occupant in either owned or leased space to release some of their space or all of their space. But there have been a few changes to the process. First and foremost, if you are in a federally owned building, you no longer have to occupy the space for 16 months before you can release the space, because we presume that most federal tenants are long-term tenants in our buildings. You still must occupy a lease for 16 months prior to release of space, or pay the commensurate amount of that rent. In addition to that, in order to corral all of the releases of space that we get, in the past, they have gone everywhere. They've gone to property managers, they've gone to account managers, they've gone to LCOs, they've gone numerous places until they finally ended up somewhere within the organization where someone could actually release the space, which could be a long time. And customers never knew exactly what the status of their request was. Our national office in 2016 created a space release mailbox, space.release@gsa.gov. And that's where you should send your space release requests. If you happen to send it to someone that you're working with, they can forward it to that mailbox, and we ask them to do that. But if you could make that your first step in releasing your space, that would be really, really helpful. That mailbox will notify the appropriate region. So this is national, this is not a regional policy. Once you do that, you'll get a response from the space release mailbox letting you know we've gotten your request and it's been forwarded, and you'll know who it's been forwarded to, which region, and who in which region. And once that happens, that is when the clock starts ticking. So I know that there are a few situations where space release has bounced around. It's gone to one of those parties that I mentioned, and it's kind of bounced around for a while. The clock starts ticking once the space release mailbox has received the request, regardless of who it came from. Once they have notified the region, the regional contact has 10 days to provide a response to you that yes, your request is accepted, and will release the space, and providing you the effective date of the release, or no, we can't release the space because it's not marketable. Or in some cases, it might take a little bit longer to determine exactly what we can do. But in that case, you would still receive an interim response. Once we respond to you and confirm the date that the space will be released, I should take a step back. While we are confirming that, what we're really looking for is whether or not the space is marketable. Whether it has windows, whether it's accessible from a common corridor, whether it has access to either the building exterior or the common corridor to the lobby and out of the building, and whether it does not depend on whether or not we can backfill the space. That is not a consideration. But we do need to know if the space is cancelable or non-cancelable. If your space happens to be non-cancelable, it doesn't mean that you can't release it. If we determine that we can backfill the space, we could release it. But if it's a non-cancelable OA that is in a location where we have no backfill potential, it's an odd term, it's a space that would require considerable reconfiguration to make it marketable, we do not have to accept it. Once we determine that the space is acceptable for release, we'll accept it. Any alterations that have to be done is the responsibility of you as a tenant. Once those are done, the space will be released. We will update your OA, and you will receive an administrative copy of the OA, which does not have to be signed. The next topic that we want to talk about, and this was a biggie, this is the change for our FAR rate, our show rates. We transitioned from 5-year show rates to 10-year show rates in September of 2017. It's kind of, in the real estate world, it's kind of a known fact that the longer you're willing to sign a lease for, the better rate you could expect to get. So we are applying that to our own buildings and giving longer occupancy terms, And by doing so, we're able to give you better rates. Even though the OA term is, well, the OA, the show rate is for a shorter term, you still retain your release of space rights, so you can still release the space with 4 months notice. And if for some reason you or the asset manager determined that we should not put a 10-year term on this particular OA, there's the building will be disposed of, is planned for disposal. The building will be undergoing a major renovation, and some tenants may have to move to swing space. Or, you know, in your own agency plans that you have something planned that's going to change your need for that particular space at some point in time. You can request a shorter rate, and the regional portfolio director is able to approve a regional pricing deviation to do that. The next change is also a very large change, and that is an MOU that was signed between GSA and the Administrative Office of the Courts back in December of 2016. As you might guess, new courthouses are very costly ventures, and in the past, because of the costs associated with them, we used return on investment pricing, which meant we based the show rate on our ability to recoup our investment in that new building. The rates were substantially higher than market rates in many cases. Based on the terms of the MOU, we will no longer build new courthouses through an ROI or return on investment strategy. New courthouses will have market-based FAR rates, and that began in October of 2018. So what that really means is for the newest, shiniest building in a particular market, we will compare ourselves to the market rather than looking at how much we invested in the building. The second part of that MOA is operating costs. Operating costs are based on the same strategy as show costs. They're market-based. So in each market, we look at what does the market charge building tenants for their operating costs through an appraisal. This change calls for moving to an actual operating cost. And in the real estate market, in the private real estate market, that is what happens. There is a reconciliation every year. Ours, we're doing it a little bit different. We look at the actual operating costs for a specific building, not for the current year, but for 3 years in the past. So when we started this in October 2019, we were using an operating cost from 2016. So the operating costs for beginning in October 2020 will be from 2017, but it is the actual operating cost. And in this way, customers are able to share in all of the energy savings measures that we've put in place in our buildings. In some few cases, the actual operating cost is actually higher than the market-based costs, but we are hopeful that those cases are few and far between. The next change that I'll talk about is the tenant floor cut. And this only applies to owned buildings. The picture, you may not be able to see it too well, but it showcases what a tenant floor cut really is. And in essence, it's a two-story space. Where there should have been a floor, there's no floor there. Now, some buildings are built that way, but it's still considered a tenant floor cut. Two-story courtrooms would be one example, but there are other examples. There could be an internal staircase. So the area where the floor is cut out to allow the staircase to go through, that's a tenant floor cut. And in those cases, the tenant is charged 50% of the full service rate for the tenant floor cut area. For courthouses, because they are on the actual operating costs plan, they will only receive that discount on the shell rate. And I should say, just to go back to the new courthouse pricing for market-based rates and for actual operating costs, any tenant that is in a courthouse, which is considered any building which has a court presence of 75% or more, would receive the benefit of market-based shell rates as well as actual operating costs. The next topic that I'd like to talk about is federal building failure restoration, which hopefully will be a positive for each of our customers. This occurred back in March of 2017. And essentially what it says is that if your TIs are damaged due to some building system failure, GSA will repair or replace those TIs up to your tenant improvement allowance, which is a huge change because of the self-insurance basis for the entire federal government family. In the past, we did not cover those types of repairs or damages. Unfortunately, this policy does not extend to equipment or personal property. So any servers, computers that are damaged are not covered. Any employee's personal property that is damaged due to a building failure is not covered under this policy. We are not allowed to cover those things with tenant improvements. So just to give you an example of how this policy actually works, if a customer occupies, say, half of a floor or a whole floor, and half of the floor is damaged by a sprinkler leak, we would determine that 50% of the floor needs restoration and what those repairs need to be. We look at your TI allowance for that square footage that we determine has been damaged, and apply that TI allowance to that square footage. And that is what is available to repair that portion of the floor that has been damaged.
Kim, we had a question. What about catastrophic damages?
I'm not sure what catastrophic damages, what that means.
Okay. Maybe we can get some clarification on that and circle back.
Yeah, that would help. The only time that GSA is not responsible is when it is clearly a tenant caused, tenant caused damage.
Okay, Kim, to be specific, an earthquake or flooding?
Oh, that's a really good question. My silence is thinking. We have not yet had a circumstance like that. As far as I have been aware, when there is flooding, it is in the lower parts of the building, which typically is our equipment or lobby space, basement space, that kind of thing. Although we did have an issue in Ohio several years ago, the hurricane-driven winds and rain caused leakage around windows in a courtroom. And we did cover that damage. So I can't say for sure that all catastrophic damage is covered, but that is something that I will look into, and we'll answer it on the fact that we frequently asked question page that we issue.
Okay, thank you, Kim.
Okay. The next topic is also new, and that is a national specification for federal buildings. And this is kind of an outcome of COVID. We were doing it, it was happening anyway, but COVID-19 sped this up. Much like leases, where there is a standard written in every lease of the cleaning and operations that the lessor is responsible for providing, we are standardizing our custodial and operations and maintenance specifications so that all customers can see and know what to expect in the level of service in our buildings. These specs are performance-based, meaning it doesn't necessarily say you have to do this type of maintenance so many times a year. It would talk about more the result, that floors must be kept clean at all times, let's say. So it's up to the contractor to tell us we're going to wax those floors every week or every month or twice a month, that kind of thing. But we are looking for national consistency so that every customer knows what to expect in any of our buildings. And hopefully by using standardized specifications, we'll also be able to reduce our operating costs, which if a tenant is in a building with 75% or more court family agencies, they would see the benefit of that.
Kim, back to the last question with the catastrophic damages. What about mold remediation?
If we determine that it is due to a building failure, that would be covered.
Okay, thank you.
The next topic that I would like to talk about is forced move exceptions. This is also new, and this is something that we now have a standard clause that we put in your OA. If we are issuing an OA for less than a 10-year term, as long as we tell the agency at least 3 years in advance that you may have to relocate due to a potential building disposal or a prospectus project that we are planning, this is not considered a forced move. So you would have time to budget. In cases where we don't get the funding this year, say for a prospectus project, but we expect it next year, we can do a year-to-year extension on that OA. And it would explain the need for a potential relocation. So I think I will turn it back over to Cece at this point to talk about recurring services.
Okay, so back in 2018, we made a change to how we handle recurring service in lease locations. So recurring, recurring services are above standard costs that are the same every month. Examples are overtime utilities like 24/7 HVAC or equipment maintenance and things of that nature that we had been requiring R-type RWAs to be supplied at the beginning of every fiscal year to cover those costs. So these costs can now be incorporated into leases as part of the operating rent and passed through to the OA. So this was a huge savings, eliminating an administrative burden and lowering the cost for the lessor and GSA and the customers who all had to manage all of that associated with those costs. Now they just pass through, so far fewer RWAs. This doesn't apply to non-recurring, which are one-time types of services. Those time, we're not doing anything like this in owned locations. So this is exclusively for leases. So we had one minor change in free space. So generally GSA can accept free space when we go out for a lease if a lessor is going to provide us with more space than we need, he can, you know, not charge. They won't charge for the additional space. In the case of prospectus or congressional committee resolution, those that have a maximum square footage, we cannot exceed that. So we cannot accept any free space that exceeds that maximum square footage with no exceptions. So there's no ability to get around that. Okay, billing adjustments. So we had a lease audit, and the IG and the general counsel came up with some modifications to how we handle billing adjustments. So billing adjustments typically are for real estate tax escalation pass-throughs or adjustments from errors that occurred in those in past years. And we do billing adjustments generally for the current and the prior year. And previously, our threshold for doing anything further back than that, further back than 1 year prior, was $50,000 per year per OA. Otherwise, we would just not create a billing adjustment for that. So that threshold has been greatly reduced. Now billing adjustments, billing adjustments for the current and the prior year are done for any amount, even amounts smaller than 1,000. But for older billing adjustments, if the amount is $1,000 or more, we will pass those through. And that is whether it is a additional charge or a credit to the customer. So you will, you can expect to see occasionally billing adjustments that go back to previous years for smaller amounts than had been the case before. Okay, and then Kim's going to talk about lease market surveys.
Before we start, we had one question coming in. Well, I guess there was a concern as to, or a question as to why we pay for GSA's upgrades for the federal building.
I need a little more context in terms of what upgrades what type of upgrades we're talking about.
Okay. We can get that and circle back around.
Okay, all right. So the next topic is of our changes is new, and it defines what market survey services GSA provides. You'll hear more about this in the next presentation in this series on direct charging, but this specific definition is for market surveys. As you know, the PBS fee covers quite a few things, and one of the things that it covers is a market survey. The 5th edition defines that market survey as a single market survey covered by the PBS fee. It is also defining that it's the customer's responsibility to schedule all necessary personnel. So if everyone from the customer agency can't make the market survey, if another one is required, that would be funded by the customer through an RWA. We can determine if additional market surveys are needed because of a lack of competition or a change in the agency requirements. And then it would be up to PBS to determine if that is covered by the PBS fee, or if that's something that the customer should pay for through an RWA.
And we did get some clarification on the last question.
Okay.
The question is, there was a concern as to why we pay for GSA's upgrades for a federal building. In regards to ceiling upgrades, like in Cincinnati federal building for ETF.
So it's a little hard to address specific projects if I'm not aware of what the total situation is with that specific project. Many times, so if we're talking about a specific agency space that you're moving into, and since so many of you have shown that you know a lot more about pricing policy than you let on in the beginning, you know that for new occupancies, GSA funds the ceiling for an open office area, and any private offices that are required, any upcharge for that is considered TI and falls to the agency to fund either through their allowance or through an RWA. We have had situations where tenants have occupied spaces for so long that the ceiling tiles fail. And in that case, if they never had the benefit of that initial tenant improvement allowance because they occupied the space before there was a tenant improvement allowance, since this policy came into place in the late 90s, we would do that initial ceiling, open office ceiling, and fund that. And the agency would be required to fund any private offices that are required. If there is a building-wide project to upgrade the ceilings, it's interesting that ATF is saying they paid for that because CC and I have done multiple presentations on TI and Shell, and we have had many conversations with property managers that those building-wide projects that have been funded by GSA should not be done that way. If you are talking about projects where there are ceiling upgrades in the common areas, I would say that customers do not directly pay for that. And by directly, I mean you pay your rent into the Federal Buildings Fund, and we receive our funding from the Federal Buildings Fund, but it's not a direct charge to you. If you are doing one more situation, sorry, Arissa. If you're doing a renovation project in a space that you are already occupying and it is not tied to a new occupancy, and there's a new ceiling that is part of that project, that would be considered a TI, and that would be a customer cost. So I think I've covered every situation that I can think of. If there is a specific situation, and it sounds like it is, that you have a question about, if you maybe want to provide a little bit more information, and I can find out more about the project, and that would be the best way for me to address that.
Okay. Aurora did say thank you for your clarification, so I believe you may have answered it, but if not, Aurora, just provide a little bit more information and we can answer that for you. We did have one more question, that due to COVID-19, can we have a virtual market survey?
Oh, that is a really good question. So I'm not sure. It seems like you could. That would really be a question for our real estate people who conduct the market surveys. I know they've done virtual project inspections. So that is a good question, and we will ask them and put that in our FAQ.
Okay, yeah, it looks like some people are saying that they have had virtual market surveys, but we will follow up on that.
Okay, yeah, that only makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Kim.
Okay, our next topic is design intent drawings. So, as we all know, design intent drawings are not full-scale construction drawings. They typically only show the shell requirements, where walls go and doors go, and it's part of the shell rent, so it's not something that you pay for. Typically only level 1 DIDs, so there's not a lot of detail that is included in them. Shows where the lighting goes and, you know, the kind of the ceiling grid, but it doesn't show furniture placement. It doesn't get into mechanical or electrical or plumbing or anything like that. If a customer needs something more detailed, that would be a reimbursable cost. Also, normally we don't have DID workshops where everyone sits down together and kind of goes through the drawings and works it out. Normally, as you guys know, the drawings are sent back and forth. You get an opportunity to view them and mark them up. But we can do a workshop where everyone, the lessor, the project manager, the AE, are all in the same room. That is an option. Next topic is building shell definition for warehouses. I found this one fascinating. I had never heard of this until a couple of years ago. Our national office was having a meeting, and some regions discussed how this was something that they did regularly in their region. Apparently, in regions or areas of the country where office space is very expensive, agencies were requesting warehouse space and then building it out to office level space. So if you can envision, you know, the double height warehouse with the concrete floor and minimal lighting and no conditioned air, and turning that into office space. Based on that, the warehouse space now has a distinct shell definition, which says, number 1, that it's going to match the warehouse lease model. Number 2, the space has no ceiling, it has minimal lighting, and it has no conditioned air. And on that, I'm going to turn back over to Cece to talk about a huge topic that everyone is very interested in: customer agency funded shell.
Okay, so as it shows at the top, this is for owned space. So these notes that are from the pricing desk guide, they highlight when we can accept RWA funds for agency funded shell. So agency funded shell is whenever a customer is paying for something that GSA is responsible for in accordance with our pricing policy. So any shell elements, and things of that nature, that is when this comes into play. So we had some changes, most especially around fire life safety issues like asbestos containing material abatement and lead abatement, that moved those from oftentimes being a tenant cost to being GSA's responsibility. So we now recognize that, you know, with customer-driven projects, it's not always practical for GSA. They don't always have the funds available to cover those abatement costs. And so these kind of provide some indication that we will be accepting those funds and then providing credits subsequently at project completion for the agency funded portion. Next slide. So a lot of that, like I said, has to do with this change in asbestos abatement in owned location due to the nature of a lot of our inventory, where asbestos or lead can be a costly item that comes into play even just with a, you know, recarpeting with asbestos in the mastic. So Oftentimes the customer has a project and due to lack of BA 54 funds, it's impossible to move forward unless the customer funds that. So we can, with a pricing deviation, accept those funds. And if it's a fire life safety issue, we will provide 100% credit. If that agency funded shell item is other than a fire life safety issue, the credit that will be given at project completion will be 60%, and that would be spread in accordance with what the shell rent is on that particular OA. Okay, Kim, back to you.
Cece just talked about the biggest change in shell and TI, but there are a few other changes that the 5th edition clarifies for us. One is the lighting fixture per square footage. So there's now 1 fixture per 80 usable square feet. As lighting becomes more complex, its energy savings becomes a bigger issue in lighting systems. Lighting control systems become more and more common, and there has, over the last few years, there's always a question of, well, who pays for the lighting control systems? Who pays for updating the lighting control systems and all of the coding that goes into that? That is a shell cost. So systems that have daylight availability, occupancy sensors, vacancy sensors, tie into building automation systems, those are a shell cost now, as well as the maintenance of those systems. We now use F number values for floor flatness and levelness. In the 4th edition, the shell requirement was a level floor, and it didn't give a whole lot more definition than that. This can be a considerable cost in some of our older buildings where there could be a 4 or 5 inch difference in the floor level from one end of the floor to the other. So that it's clear now that is a building shell requirement. And finally, because of energy conservation, more energy efficient equipment, the electrical power distribution panels and the circuit breakers now have to provide a capacity of 4 watts per usable square foot. That doesn't include lighting, that doesn't include HVAC. That is strictly what is provided to tenant spaces for equipment and desk lighting, task lighting. The next change is a welcome change for all around. We were very excited about this, and that is an increase in the general allowance. In the 4th edition, the general allowance for tenant improvements was $38.95, and that is scaled up or down depending on location. In the 5th edition, that allowance has increased to $49.13. There will be an annual adjustment, and it is geared for an open office layout. The caveat is pursuant to funding to GSA. So as long as we get the budget to increase that general allowance, we will. If we do not get a budget that allows us to keep up with that, there may be years where that adjustment does not happen. The next topic, this is a big one, and I think it is probably a welcome one for customers. This change allows all customers who are in 2nd generation space or relet space, defined as space that's been built out in the past, are now able to fund TIs through an RWA. In the past, in the 4th edition, an agency, a new tenant that was going into 2nd generation space been built out in the past had to reuse most of the existing tenant improvements in order to be able to fund any improvements the new user wanted to make through an RWA. And further, GSA was required to provide a general TI to all new tenants. So it was very restrictive. You had to meet a pretty high bar. And normally when people ask me, well, how do you define reusing the majority of existing TIs? I looked at the square footage that was affected. I looked at the dollar value of the project. I had one instance where an office tenant said they were reusing most of the existing tenant improvements. And it was a large space, but not a huge space. But their TI budget for office space was over $1 million. So that was kind of it was not a checklist kind of thing. You had to look at each project on its own, but this allows us to look at a space that has been built out in the past, and no matter what tenant improvements the new user is planning to do, saving some of the improvements or demolishing them all, it can still be funded by an RWA. Or partially funded by an RWA if that's what the tenant would prefer. So again, PBS is no longer required to provide a general allowance, and the tenant is no longer required to substantially use existing alterations. So I'm going to hand things back over to Arissa. That pretty much concludes all of the changes that we wanted to share with you today.
Okay, thanks, Kim. If anyone does have any final questions, we'll give it a minute. Just type them in the chat box or any comments that you have, and we will take a few minutes to address those. Okay. It looks like that might be it. If there's no more questions, our regional administrator, Brad Hansher, wanted to say a few words before we ended. Brad, are you available?
That I am. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, first off, I just wanted to say thank you to Arissa, both Kimberly's, Dominique, Cecilia, Gia, John, and Rebecca. I know that I speak for all of us, along with the rest of the team here in the region, when we say thank you. Thank you for what you do every day in serving the American people. GSA appreciates each and every one of our customers, and we appreciate the important work that you do. And I want to assure you that we will always make ourselves available to provide you with the support that you need and have come to expect. I want to emphasize that when it comes to serving any of our clients, it starts and it ends with our team's focus simply being listening to you and understanding your needs. We hope that we get to see you again on August 17th for the third and final installment of the series that will be focused on our direct charge policy. And with that, again, thank you, be well, and stay safe.
Thank you, Brad. And thanks everyone for a good discussion today. We will email formal replies to all the questions in a Q&A document. If you have any feedback for us, which we greatly appreciate and welcome, you will have the opportunity to do so via a link in the thank you email that you'll be receiving shortly. As Brad mentioned, this is just the second of our customer service series, so watch your email for the next session, which will cover direct charge policy on August 17th. Thank you to all for attending and to our panelists. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.